Can you imagine? A 72-year-old father driven up the mountain by his only son on a freezing winter night, then abandoned in a crumbling cabin in a blizzard, with no phone, no food, no fire for warmth? Not an enemy, not a stranger. It was the son he had raised, the one he had sacrificed his whole life for. And as the snow began to fill the doorway, Walter Grayson realized a horrifying truth. His son had planned for him to die there. If you want to know how Walter survived and how he got his revenge, hit like, comment the name of the city you're watching, and follow this story to the end. I used to think that the worst kind of loneliness was the kind you felt in a crowd. Standing at a party surrounded by neighbors who smiled at you but couldn't remember your name. Sitting at a dinner table while conversation flowed around you like water around a stone. I knew that loneliness well. I'd lived inside it for years after my wife Carol passed. But I was wrong about what loneliness really was. The worst kind, the kind that hollows you out completely, is the loneliness you feel when you realize the one person you trusted with everything has been quietly, methodically, cheerfully planning your death. I know how that sounds. Dramatic. Like something out of a crime show Carol used to watch on Sunday evenings, wrapped in her blue quilt, eating the crackers she wasn't supposed to have because of her blood pressure. She'd have laughed at me for saying it that way. She'd have said, "Walt, you always were a flair for the theatrical." But Carol isn't here to laugh anymore. And what Ethan did to me wasn't theatrical. It was cold, and it was calculated, and it started long before the night he drove me up into the Harlan Ridge Mountains and left me there to freeze. It started the morning I signed my name on a piece of paper I should never have touched. Teague, my name is Walter Grayson. I'm 72 years old. I spent 31 years working as a structural engineer for a mid-sized firm out of Clover Falls, Virginia. The kind of work that nobody romanticizes. The kind where you show up at 6 a.m. and leave when the problem is solved, not when the clock says so. I built bridges, technically speaking. Reinforced overpasses. Signed off on load-bearing calculations for buildings that still stand today. Buildings I sometimes drive past and feel something I can only describe as quiet pride. I also built one son, and that, as it turned out, was the structure that failed. After Carol died, pancreatic cancer, 14 months from diagnosis to the end, and every one of those months a kind of slow devastation I don't have adequate words for. I fell apart in the way that men of my generation fall apart, quietly and completely and in private. I stopped eating real meals. I stopped returning phone calls. I sat in the house we'd shared for 38 years and let the rooms go dusty because cleaning them meant acknowledging she wasn't coming back to see them clean. Ethan came around more during those months. I want to be honest about that. He showed up. He brought groceries I didn't ask for and sat on the couch and turned on the TV and sometimes just existed in the same room with me, which is more than some sons would have done. I was grateful. I told myself I was lucky to have him. What I didn't understand then, what I understand now with an exhausting, bone-deep clarity, is that Ethan wasn't coming around because he loved me. He was coming around because he was doing inventory. He was cataloging, evaluating, making lists in his head of what I had and how to get his hands on it. I'd done well over my career. Not spectacularly well, but honestly well. The kind of financial stability that comes from living below your means for 4 decades. From never buying a boat you couldn't afford, from putting money away every month even when it was inconvenient. The house in Clover Falls was paid off. I had retirement accounts, a modest investment portfolio that a financial advisor named Dennis had helped me build over 20 years. There was also a piece of land, 12 acres up near Dunmore County, that Carol and I had bought in our 40s as a kind of dream, imagining we'd build a second home there someday. We never got around to it. All told, when the estate attorneys did the math after everything happened, it came to roughly $2.3 million. To Ethan, that number must have looked like the answer to every problem he'd ever created for himself. Because Ethan had problems. I knew about some of them. I didn't know about most. He was 44 years old, my son, and he had never managed to build anything that held. 3 marriages, the last of which ended badly enough that the divorce left him owing his ex-wife Diane a monthly payment that apparently made him furious to discuss. A restaurant venture that collapsed inside 18 months. A real estate partnership that went sideways when his partner discovered Ethan had been running costs through the books in a way that, I'm told, a prosecutor might have found interesting had Diane not decided against pressing it. He was charming in the way of people who have survived on charm long past the point where substance should have taken over. He could walk into a room and make you feel, within 10 minutes, that you were his favorite person in the world. He made me feel that way, even though I was his father and should have known better. The conversation that changed everything happened on a Tuesday in late February, about 8 months after Carol's funeral. Ethan came over in the early evening. He brought Thai food from a place I liked, and we sat at the kitchen table and ate pad see ew out of containers, while he asked careful, gentle questions about how I was managing. "You seem tired, Dad." "I am tired." "Are you keeping up with the accounts? Dennis still managing everything?" "Dennis retired," I said. "He handed things off to a younger guy at the firm, Gary something. I haven't met him yet." Ethan looked at me with an expression I now recognize as calculated concern. At the time, I read it as love. "Dad, that worries me a little. You're dealing with a lot. You just lost Mom. You shouldn't have to be managing financial relationships on top of everything." "I'm fine, Ethan." "You had that scare with your heart last fall." That was true. An arrhythmia that put me in the hospital for 4 days in October, ultimately controlled with medication, but frightening enough that my cardiologist had sat me down and given me the talk about stress management and the importance of support systems. "My heart is fine," I said. "I'm on the medication. It's under control." I know. He pushed a piece of broccoli around his container. "I'm not trying to alarm you. What if something happened suddenly? What if you had another episode and you couldn't make decisions for yourself? Do you have anyone designated to step in?" I didn't. Carol had been that person. We'd had durable powers of attorney naming each other, but after she died, I hadn't updated the documents. It was on my list, that long, shapeless list of things I kept meaning to deal with. "I should probably update my paperwork," I said. "I was thinking the same thing," Ethan said, and refilled my water glass without being asked. "I'm not suggesting anything dramatic, just maybe it makes sense for me to be listed, so that if something happened, I could step in quickly, handle things, make sure nothing fell through the cracks." It sounded reasonable. It sounded like a son taking care of his father. It sounded like exactly what Carol would have wanted. "Let me think about it," I said. "Of course," he said. "Take your time." He left the leftovers in my refrigerator and kissed me on the top of my head when he said goodbye, like I was the child and he was the adult. I stood at the window and watched his car pull out of the driveway, and I thought, I raised a good man. I had not raised a good man. I had raised a man who was very good at appearing to be good. Over the next 6 weeks, Ethan brought it up 3 more times. Never aggressively, never in a way I could point to and say, "There, that's pressure." It was always gentle, always framed around concern. He sent me an article about older adults who ended up in financial difficulty after a health event because no one had authority to manage their affairs. He mentioned a neighbor of his, entirely fictional, I later realized, whose father had suffered a stroke and whose accounts had been frozen during the medical emergency because there was no one with legal authority to act. The attorney Ethan took me to was named Marcus Fowler. His office was in a business park 15 minutes from my house. Clean, neutral, the kind of office designed to feel trustworthy without being flashy. Ethan sat beside me during the consultation, which I allowed because I wasn't thinking clearly enough to realize I should have been alone with the attorney. The documents Marcus Fowler prepared gave Ethan financial power of attorney, authority to manage my accounts, make investment decisions on my behalf, transfer funds if necessary for my care and well-being. There was also a healthcare directive and a section about property management. Fowler explained it in smooth, practiced language, and I asked a few questions, and the answers satisfied me in the way that a good salesman's answers always satisfy you in the moment, and then I signed. I signed because I was tired, because I was grieving, because Ethan was sitting beside me looking like a devoted son, and I wanted to believe that was what he was. I signed, and it was the most expensive mistake of my life. The changes were gradual at first, small enough that each one had a plausible explanation. In April, Ethan mentioned he'd moved my investment accounts to a new firm. Lower fees, better returns. I vetted them thoroughly. He showed me paperwork I looked at without really reading. In May, he said he'd consolidated my savings accounts at a single bank for simplicity. He brought me the new statements. The totals looked approximately right. I wasn't checking carefully. I wasn't sleeping well. My cardiologist had adjusted my medication and the new dosage left me foggy in the mornings. In June, the Dunmore County land was transferred out of my name. I didn't know that for months. Ethan had authority to manage my property interests as needed for tax efficiency and estate planning purposes. He exercised it quietly, through a series of transactions I only reconstructed later with the help of an attorney who spent 3 weeks pulling documents. The land went to an LLC Ethan had created. The purchase price listed in the transaction was $42,000. The land was worth substantially more. The buyer, the LLC, was owned by Ethan through 2 intermediate entities. He sold it to himself, at a fraction of its value, using authority I'd given him to protect me. In August, I had another cardiac episode. Not as severe as the first, but severe enough that I spent 2 nights in the hospital and came home with new restrictions on physical activity and a general instruction to reduce stress. Ethan visited me in the hospital every day. He brought books I didn't read and sat in the chair beside my bed and talked about nothing in particular, and I was grateful for his presence in the way that sick people are grateful for any warm body in the room. "You need to rest, Dad," he said on the second evening. "Stop worrying about things. Let me handle whatever needs handling. That's what I'm here for." "I know," I said. "I know." I went home and I rested and I let him handle whatever needed handling. By the time I recovered enough to start paying attention, really paying attention, it was October. And by October, most of what I had was already gone. The moment I understood what was happening was not a dramatic one. It was quiet and banal and arrived in the form of an envelope. Dennis, my retired financial advisor, had apparently stayed on a mailing list somewhere because a statement from an account I hadn't thought about in years arrived at my address addressed to me, not to Ethan. It showed a balance that was wrong, a balance that should have been significantly higher. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time looking at that statement. Then I called Dennis, who was now living in Scottsdale and spending his retirement playing golf and watching his grandchildren, and I described what I was seeing. There was a pause on the line. "Walt," Dennis said carefully, "what exactly did you sign when you gave Ethan that power of attorney?" I told him. Another pause. Longer. "I think you should call an attorney," Dennis said. "Not the one Ethan took you to, a different one. Today, if you can." I called. The attorney I reached, a woman named Patricia Ames who worked in elder law, asked me to come in the following week and to bring every financial document I could locate. I spent the next 4 days going through files, calling account numbers, pulling statements I'd largely ignored over the past 8 months. What I found was the systematic, patient dismantling of everything Carol and I had built together. I should have confronted Ethan then. I know that. But something stopped me. Some combination of fear and disbelief, and that particular paralysis that comes when you're standing on the edge of a truth so large that knowing it fully will change every memory you have of the person who created it. Instead, I made an appointment with Patricia Ames and said nothing to Ethan. The appointment was for a Wednesday morning in late October. On the Tuesday evening before it, Ethan called and said he wanted to take me to dinner, a new steak place near the river. He'd made a reservation. He said he wanted to spend some time together, just the 2 of us. I should have said no, but I didn't want him to know anything was different. I said yes. We had dinner. Ethan was warm and funny, and asked me questions about my engineering projects from 20 years ago. Stories he'd heard before but pretended to hear fresh, nodding in the right places, laughing when he was supposed to laugh. He ordered a good bottle of wine and let me drink the larger share of it. We talked about Carol, briefly, in the careful way we'd learned to talk about her, touching the subject and then moving away before the grief got its hands around either of us. After dinner, he drove me home through the back roads he'd known since he was a teenager, and when we reached the house, he put the car in park and sat there for a moment. "You seem more like yourself lately," he said. "Do I?" "Yeah." He looked at me with that expression again, the performed concern that I'd spent 8 months reading as love. "I've been worried about you. The episodes, living alone, I think about it a lot." "I'm fine, Ethan." "I know." He paused. "I was actually thinking, there's a place up near Harlan Ridge. A friend of mine has a cabin. It's beautiful in winter. I thought maybe this weekend we could drive up, just the 2 of us, spend a couple of days, get you out of the house." I looked at him. Something moved through me in that moment, something I can't name precisely. Not quite suspicion, not quite fear. A vibration. The way a load-bearing structure hums just before the stress exceeds its tolerance. A cabin, I said. Yeah, nothing fancy, but it's quiet, clean air. I think it'd be good for you. I should have said no. I had an appointment in the morning with an attorney who was going to tell me what I already half knew. I should have said no and gone inside and locked my door. But I said yes. Because even then, even with everything I'd begun to understand about what he'd done, some small remaining piece of me needed to believe I was wrong about my own son. We drove up on Saturday. The weather had been gray all week, and the forecast was uncertain, but Ethan said it wasn't supposed to be bad, just cloudy. We left before sunrise, my overnight bag in the back seat, Ethan's hands easy on the wheel. He talked the whole drive up, about a friend he'd had lunch with, about a documentary he'd watched. Light, frictionless conversation that required nothing from me except occasional acknowledgement. I looked out the window at the Virginia landscape going from flat to rolling to steep as we climbed, and I thought about Carol, and I thought about Patricia Ames, and I thought about the statement in the envelope. The cabin was 3 hours up, at the end of a dirt road that split off from a state route I'd never been on before. We arrived mid-morning. It was smaller than I'd imagined. A single-story structure that had been decent once, but had the look of a place that hadn't been regularly maintained in a long time. The porch boards were soft underfoot. The windows had accumulated a particular kind of grime that spoke of seasons, not weeks. It's rustic, Ethan said, carrying things inside. But it's got heat and a stove. Everything we need. I walked through the rooms while he got settled. The interior was spare. A main room with a wood stove, a kitchen with an old gas range, 2 small bedrooms, a bathroom with intermittent water pressure. The firewood stacked beside the stove was not a large stack. The pantry had a few canned goods, coffee, some crackers. I thought, this is fine. This is manageable. I thought, my son brought me here because he wants time with me. I thought that, and it was the last innocent thought I had. The second evening, after we'd eaten a simple dinner and the temperature outside had dropped sharply, further than the forecast had suggested, Ethan said he needed to drive back down the mountain to pick up something he'd forgotten. He was vague about what it was. He'd leave me the lantern, he said. He wouldn't be more than an hour or 2. Ethan, it's late. It can wait until morning. It really can't. He put on his jacket and checked his phone, a gesture that struck me as odd, as if he was checking something other than the time. I'll be back before you're asleep. He picked up his car keys. Then he paused at the door and looked at me in a way I had never seen him look at me before. Not with love, not with performed concern, not with any of the expressions I'd catalogued over 44 years of knowing his face. It was a look of finality, of closure, like a man who had finished an unpleasant task and was relieved to be walking away from it. "Dad," he said, and then he stopped. "What?" He opened the door. Cold air rolled in, carrying the particular smell of snow that people who grow up in mountains learn to recognize. Not the smell of snow falling, but the smell of snow coming. "Nothing," he said. "Get some rest." And he left. I stood at the window and watched his headlights sweep across the trees at the end of the road, and then there was only darkness and the beginning of wind. An hour passed, then 2. The temperature inside the cabin began to drop in a way that told me the wood stove wasn't drafting correctly. A blockage somewhere in the flue, or a problem with the damper I hadn't noticed. I fed it more wood. It helped for a while. I tried the landline. The phone was dead. Not ringing, just silence. My cell phone showed a single bar that flickered and disappeared. 3 hours after Ethan left, I was sitting by a fire that was losing the battle against the cold, wrapped in every piece of fabric I could find in the cabin, and snow was coming down hard enough outside that the window had gone entirely white. And I understood, not as a suspicion, not as a fear, as a fact. The clean, terrible, load-bearing fact that structural engineers are trained to face without flinching. The structure had failed. The thing I had built, or believed I had built, was not there. My son had brought me here to die. He had driven 3 hours into the mountains with his father in the passenger seat, and he had left me in a cabin with inadequate firewood and a broken stove and no working phone in the first serious snowstorm of the season, and he had looked at me with that expression of finality, and he had driven away. He hadn't said, "I love you, Dad." He hadn't said anything at all. I sat in the cold and dark and let that truth settle into me the way cold settles into old bones. Slowly, completely, without mercy. And then, because I was 72 years old and I had built bridges, and I had buried my wife and I had survived a cardiac episode, and I was not yet finished, I got up. I started looking for a way to live. The first thing I did was stop feeling sorry for myself. That sounds simple. It wasn't. When you're sitting in a failing cabin at 10 o'clock at night with snow piling up against the door and the temperature dropping fast enough that you can see your own breath in the glow of a lantern that's already burning low on fuel, the grief of what just happened to you wants to fill every available space in your mind. It wants to be the only thing. It wants you to sit down and accept it. I didn't sit down. I moved. I pulled every drawer open in that kitchen looking for anything useful. Matches, candles, a flashlight with batteries that still had life in them. I found a half-burned box of matches, 3 pillar candles that had been used before and put away, a flashlight that worked if you held the back casing at the right angle and applied pressure. I found 2 wool blankets in the closet of the larger bedroom, both smelling of must and disuse, and I wrapped them around my shoulders and kept moving. The wood stove was the problem. The fire I'd been feeding had dropped to orange embers, and every time I added wood it would catch briefly and then subside. Too much smoke, not enough draw. I'd worked around enough construction projects to know what a blocked flue meant, and I knew I wasn't going to fix it in the dark in a snowstorm. But I'd also spent enough time in old buildings to know that a bad flue wasn't always a completely blocked one. Sometimes it just needed convincing. I found a fireplace poker behind the stove. I opened the damper all the way, got on my knees in front of the stove despite what that position did to my joints, and used the poker to clear what I could reach of the flue opening. A fall of soot and debris came down. I coughed for a while. Then I rebuilt the fire carefully. Small pieces first, letting the draft establish before adding anything heavy. And this time it caught. Not beautifully. Not the way a well-maintained stove catches, with a clean roar and instant warmth. It was reluctant and smoky, and I had to leave the cabin door cracked for 15 minutes to let the smoke thin, which dropped the interior temperature further and made me feel briefly like the effort was costing more than it was buying. But the fire held. I closed the door. I pulled the blankets tighter and sat as close to the stove as I safely could, and I thought about what I was working with. Firewood, enough for the night, maybe into mid-morning if I was careful. Food, canned soup, some crackers, a box of oatmeal, coffee. Water, the tap still worked, which meant the pipes hadn't frozen yet. Heat, marginal but present. Light, the flashlight, the candles. Phone signal, nothing. The storm outside had become serious. Even through the walls, I could hear the particular sound of heavy accumulation. The muffled quality the world takes on when snow is deep enough to start absorbing sound rather than reflecting it. The road Ethan had driven up was a dirt road. By morning, it would be impassable. That was by design. I understood that now. He'd watched the forecast. He'd picked this weekend for a reason. I sat with that thought and let myself feel it fully. The premeditation of it, the patience it required, the intimacy of a plan that could only be made by someone who knew me well enough to know I would say yes to a weekend in the mountains with my son. You have to know someone's hope in order to use it against them. Ethan had known mine exactly, and then I put it away. Not because it didn't matter. It would matter enormously, later, in ways I wasn't yet equipped to calculate, but because the only question that mattered at that moment was whether I would still be alive to hold him accountable for it. Grief and fury are luxuries. Survival is not. I started searching the cabin properly. I went through every cabinet, every closet, under both beds, in the space above the bathroom ceiling where old cabins sometimes have accessible storage. What I was looking for specifically, I couldn't have told you. Evidence of what might be useful. Anything the cabin's original owners might have left behind that Ethan, who almost certainly hadn't spent significant time here, might not have known about or thought to remove. In the second bedroom closet, behind a collapsed shelf that someone had taken down and never rehung, I found a cardboard box. Inside the box, a coil of rope, a rusted hand tool I identified as a hatchet after cleaning off the surface with my sleeve, a folded topographic map of the Harlan Ridge area, and, shoved into the corner of the box as if it had been placed there and forgotten. An emergency radio. Not a modern one. Old. Military surplus vintage, the kind with a hand crank and a pull-out antenna, the kind that was made to be dropped in a river and still function. The plastic casing had yellowed and one of the corner seams had separated slightly, but when I pulled out the antenna and cranked the handle the way the worn instruction label directed, the dial lit up. I cannot tell you what that light looked like in that cabin at that moment. I can only say that I stood there holding that radio and felt something shift in my chest. Something that had been locked rigid since the moment I watched Ethan's headlights disappear into the trees. I cranked it for 2 full minutes, the way the label said, before I touched the dial. The first frequency I tried produced static. The second, static with an occasional fragment of something. Weather broadcast, I thought, but too broken to read. The third frequency, more static, but with a different texture. Not empty. Occupied. I pressed the transmit button. "This is Walter Grayson. I'm stranded on Harlan Ridge. Does anyone copy?" Static. I tried again, adjusted the antenna, moved to stand by the window with the radio, which helped the signal marginally. "This is Walter Grayson. I'm at a cabin on Harlan Ridge off Route 9. I am 72 years old and I need help. Does anyone copy?" For a long moment, nothing. Then, a voice. Male, older, not panicked, with the particular flat practicality of someone who's used a radio before. "Copy you. Say your location again." I said it again, more slowly. "Harlan Ridge off Route 9. A pause, the sound of something being moved or written. "There's only one cabin out that way I know of. Old Mercer Place?" "I don't know whose it is. I was brought here by—" I stopped. "I was brought here. I need someone to come in the morning when the road's passable." "Road's going to be rough. Storm's worse than they said." Another pause. "You got heat?" "For now." "You know who this is?" I hesitated. "No." "Name's Roy Calder. I'm on the ridge about 4 miles east. I'm not going anywhere tonight either, but come morning, if this clears the way it usually does, I'll get to you. Do you have any medical needs I should know about?" "Cardiac history. I have my medication." "All right." His voice was the voice of a man who'd dealt with difficult things before and had developed through that practice a kind of unflappable calm that was the most reassuring thing I'd heard in hours. "Keep that fire going. Crank that radio every couple of hours, and I'll be on this frequency. If anything changes, you crank it immediately." "Roy?" I said. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," he said. "Morning's a ways off." He wasn't wrong. That night was the longest of my life, and I have had some long nights. The fire required constant management. The flue was drafty enough that I had to re-establish the draw twice when it faltered, and each time I spent 20 minutes on my knees coaxing it back, which my joints registered as an extended complaint that didn't fully subside until morning. I rationed the wood with the precision of a man who'd spent his career calculating load tolerances. This much now, this much in 2 hours, this much before dawn. I didn't sleep. I sat in the chair closest to the stove with the blankets around me and the flashlight in my lap, and I let my mind go where it needed to go. It went to Carol, because it always does in the worst moments. I thought about her hands, which were practical and quick and slightly rough from years of gardening. I thought about the way she'd argued with me when she thought I was being stubborn, which was frequently, and never backed down even when I raised my voice, which I did more than I should have and am not proud of. I thought about how she'd looked at Ethan when he was small. With a love so total and physical, it was almost frightening, the way mothers sometimes look at children who've cost them enormously and are worth every cent. I thought about what Carol would have made of what her son had become. And I thought, and this is not something I say easily, that some part of her had already seen it, that she'd tried, in the careful way of women who don't want to believe the thing they're seeing, to tell me. She'd said once, about 4 years before she died after Ethan's second marriage ended, "He doesn't love the way we do, Walt. He loves what things give him." I told her she was being too hard on him. I told her every person loves differently. She'd looked at me in that way she had, not arguing, just waiting for me to catch up, and let it go. She was right. She was right, and I had years of evidence, and I chose not to see it because seeing it would have meant acknowledging that something had gone wrong inside the child I'd raised, And I didn't know how to hold that without holding myself responsible for it. I was responsible for it. Partly. Not entirely, but partly. Good intentions and a consistent paycheck are not the same thing as presence. And there were years, Ethan's teenage years especially, years when I was working 60-hour weeks and telling myself I was doing it for the family, when I was physically in the house but functionally elsewhere. That's a thing I have to live with. But there's a distance between a father's failures and what my son had done to me in those mountains. There's a canyon between imperfect love and deliberate murder. I want to be clear about that. My failures didn't create what Ethan did. They may have shaped the terrain, but the choices were his, every single one of them. I held on to that distinction through the night because I needed it. Roy Calder arrived at 11:17 the following morning. I know the time because I'd been watching the clock with the particular obsession of someone who has nothing to do but survive and wait. The storm had broken around dawn, not dramatically, just a gradual thinning of the snow and wind until the sky went from black gray to white gray to a flat, bleached winter blue. By 9 o'clock, the light coming through the windows was real light again. By 10, I'd heard a vehicle on the lower part of the road. Not close enough to identify, but close enough to know someone was moving. Roy's truck was an old Ford, the kind that's been kept running past its natural lifespan by someone who knows how to do it. He was about 65, I guessed, shorter than I expected from his voice, with the build of a man who'd done physical work his whole life and hadn't stopped. He wore a canvas coat and work gloves and a wool cap pulled low, and when he climbed out of the truck and saw me standing on the porch, he looked me over with a brisk professional assessment. "You look rough," he said, "but ambulatory. That's better than I was afraid of." "I kept the fire," I said. "I can see that." He looked at the cabin. "Old Mercer place. I was right. Haven't been up here in, well, long time." Something moved across his face that I couldn't read. "You said you were brought here. You want to tell me what happened?" I told him. I didn't dramatize it. I gave him the facts in the same order I've given them here, and Roy Calder stood in the snow in front of that cabin and listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Your son," he said finally. "My son." He looked at the tree line. He had the expression of a man managing a response he'd decided against sharing. "All right," he said, "let's get you out of here and warmed up properly. We can talk about next steps when you've had something decent to eat." He drove me back down the ridge to his property, a farmhouse that had been added onto incrementally over decades, the kind of structure that tells you everything about how the person who lives in it approaches problems, practically, in stages, without much concern for how it looks from the outside. Inside it was warm and cluttered and smelled of wood smoke and coffee. There was another person there, a woman in her 60s named Bess, who I understood quickly was Roy's partner rather than wife, and who had the manner of someone who had seen enough difficult situations to approach them without excess emotion. She put food in front of me without asking, eggs, toast, coffee, and sat down across the table while I ate. "Roy said you were in trouble," she said. "I was. You're not anymore." It wasn't consolation, it was an assessment. "Roy's going to make some calls." "What kind of calls?" Roy came in from the other room and poured himself coffee and sat down. He wrapped both hands around the mug and looked at me directly. "Before I explain, I want to ask you something. The name Walter Grayson. Were you ever with a firm called Grayson Aldrich Engineering, mid-90s? I stared at him. "That was my firm. I was never a partner. I was senior structural engineer. Aldrich was the principal." Roy nodded slowly. "I worked a project with your firm, 1997, bridge rehabilitation outside of Moorfield. You signed off on the load calculations." I had a faint memory of it, a county bridge project, straightforward work, nothing that had distinguished itself from the dozens of similar projects in that era. "I remember it. I was the site foreman," Roy said. "You came out twice during the assessment phase, caught a calculation error that would have compromised the eastern span. I always thought, if that bridge had gone through with that error, we'd have had a catastrophic failure within 5 years." He paused. "I never forgot that. Work like that, attention like that, it stays with you." There was a weight to what he was saying that I didn't entirely understand yet. Not just gratitude for old work, something more present than that. "Roy," I said, What kind of calls? He set down his coffee. I know people, he said simply. People who deal with exactly this kind of situation. Older adults who've been targeted, assets that have been moved illegally, power of attorney that's been abused. Some of them are attorneys. Some of them are investigators. Some of them are people who've been through what you've been through and came out the other side and decided to make it mean something. He held my gaze. I'm going to reach out this afternoon, with your permission. I looked at this man I'd met 18 hours ago who had come out in the morning after a snowstorm because a stranger's voice on an emergency radio had asked for help. I thought about trust, about what it had cost me to trust the wrong person and what it might cost me now to refuse to trust the right one. You have my permission, I said. Bess refilled my coffee without being asked, and Roy went to make his calls, and I sat at that kitchen table and felt, for the first time since October, that I was not entirely alone in what was coming. What I didn't know yet, what I learned in pieces over the following days, as Roy's network of people made contact and began assembling what they needed, was what Ethan had been doing since he drove away from that cabin. He had driven back to Clover Falls. He had let 48 hours pass, enough time for exposure to do what he expected exposure to do, and then he had called the Dunmore County Sheriff's Department and reported that he'd dropped his elderly father at a mountain cabin for a weekend retreat and had returned to find the cabin empty and his father nowhere to be located. His voice, according to the deputy who took the report, was appropriately distressed. He described me as increasingly confused and not always aware of where he is. He mentioned my cardiac history. He used the word wandering. He was building the story while I was still on Roy's couch, warming my feet by a wood stove and eating toast. He filed a missing persons report. He gave 2 television interviews in the following week, I saw clips of them later, in which he described a devoted son dealing with the heartbreak of a father's decline. He wore a gray sweater and looked tired in the particular way of people who want to be seen as suffering. He said he'd tried so hard to help me manage my affairs as my health worsened. He said he'd done everything he could. Meanwhile, he was liquidating what remained of my accounts, moving money through the LLC structure he'd built, making the assets harder to trace and harder to recover. He was moving fast, because somewhere in his calculation was the understanding, correct as far as it went, that once I was officially declared missing and presumed dead, a period of legal limbo would follow before he could access certain things outright, and he wanted to position himself before that clock started. He was thorough. I'll give him that. Whatever Ethan was, he was not stupid about the mechanics of what he'd done. What he was stupid about was the emergency radio. And Roy called her. And the people Roy called that afternoon, who began making their own preparations, while Ethan sat in interviews looking grieved and devoted. What he was catastrophically wrong about was the assumption that had underwritten every decision he'd made since February. The assumption that his father, old and sick and grieving, would not survive, would not fight, would not somehow find a way back. I had built bridges. I knew what it meant for a structure to hold under weight it wasn't designed for. I knew that materials tested at their limits sometimes reveal strengths that standard conditions never expose. I was 72 years old, and my son had left me to die in the mountains, and I had survived the night. I was not finished. Roy Calder was not a man who made promises lightly, and the people he called were not people who moved slowly. Within 48 hours of my arrival at his farmhouse, 3 of them had come to sit at his kitchen table with me. Patricia Ames, the elder law attorney I'd originally scheduled an appointment with before Ethan took me to dinner and drove me into the mountains, arrived first, having been reached through a professional network Roy apparently knew better than I would have expected. She was a compact woman in her mid-50s with reading glasses she kept pushing up her nose, and the particular manner of an attorney who has spent years watching older clients be taken apart by people they loved. She wasn't warm exactly, but she was precise, and precision was what I needed. The second person was a man named Gerald Fitch, a forensic accountant who worked primarily on elder financial abuse cases. He was younger than I expected, late 30s, quiet, with the habit of writing things down in a small notebook rather than typing them, which I found oddly reassuring. The third was a woman named Diane, not Ethan's ex-wife, a different Diane, Diane Ostrowski, who introduced herself simply as someone who'd been through a version of what I was describing with her own family, and who now worked with Patricia's office as an advocate. She had the face of a person who had processed a great deal of pain and arrived on the other side of it, not unmarked, but functional. I told them everything, all of it, the power of attorney, the accounts, the land, the cabin, the night in the storm. Patricia took notes. Gerald wrote in his notebook without looking up. Diane listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she looked at me in a way that was neither pitying nor detached. "He's been telling people you're unstable," she said. It wasn't a question. "He gave 2 television interviews," Roy said from the doorway where he'd been standing with his coffee. "I pulled the clips this morning." Patricia looked at me over her glasses. "Have you seen them?" "Not yet." "You should." She turned her legal pad over. "You need to know exactly what he's built before we start taking it apart." Roy brought his laptop to the table and pulled up the first interview. I watched my son sit across from a local news anchor in a gray sweater, his hands folded in his lap, his voice carrying precisely the right amount of controlled grief. He said he'd been concerned about me for months. He said my cardiac episodes had affected my cognitive clarity. He used the phrase, "not always present," to describe my mental state, which was the kind of phrase that sounds compassionate and lands like a knife. He said he'd taken over my financial management because I'd asked him to, because I'd been overwhelmed, because he'd been trying to protect me. He said he didn't know where I was, that he was frightened for me, that he hoped anyone with information would come forward. I watched the whole thing without speaking. When it ended, the table was quiet. "He's good," Gerald said finally, in the tone of someone making a professional observation rather than a compliment. "He's had practice," I said. Patricia uncapped her pen. "All right, here's where we are. The power of attorney is the foundation of everything he's done, and it's also his biggest exposure, because there are limits on what a financial POA authorizes. Limits that your son has clearly and repeatedly exceeded. Moving assets into an LLC he controls, transferring real property at below market value to an entity he owns, liquidating retirement accounts without documented medical necessity. These aren't gray areas. These are violations." She paused. "The abandonment in the cabin is a separate criminal matter entirely. That's not my domain, but it needs to be reported to law enforcement today." "He already filed a missing persons report," Roy said, positioned himself as the worried son. "Which is actually useful to us," Patricia said, "because it means there's an official record with a timestamp that we can now contradict with Walter's presence and testimony." She looked at me. "You being alive and coherent and able to give an account of what happened is the single most powerful thing we have. He built his entire story on the assumption that you were dead." I let that sit for a moment. My son had built a story on my death, had furnished it, decorated it, given television interviews inside it. "What do we do first?" I asked. "First," Patricia said, "we call the Dunmore County Sheriff's Department and we correct the missing persons report. Then we contact the Virginia State Police, because what happened on that mountain is a criminal matter and it crosses county lines. Then Gerald starts pulling the financial documentation, which is going to take time, but which I suspect is going to be extensive." She looked at Gerald. "Based on what you've described," Gerald said, still writing, "I'd estimate we're looking at 3 to 4 distinct fraud mechanisms. The LLC transfer of the land is the cleanest to document because real property transactions leave records that don't disappear. The investment account transfers will take longer. Depends on how many intermediary steps he used." He looked up. "Did he ever mention a name, a financial contact, someone who helped him set up the LLC structures?" I thought about it. "He mentioned an attorney named Marcus Fowler, the one he took me to when I signed the POA." Gerald and Patricia exchanged a look. "We know that name," Patricia said quietly. That was the first moment I understood that what Ethan had done to me might not be the first time Marcus Fowler had helped someone do it. The following 3 weeks were the strangest of my life. Stranger, in some ways, than the night in the cabin, because at least that night the threat was visible and physical, and I knew what I was fighting. What came after was a different kind of battle, slower, paperwork-driven, conducted in conference rooms and on phone calls I was only partially privy to, and requiring a patience that did not come naturally to a man who was, beneath the surface of his careful composure, furious. I stayed at Roy and Bess's farmhouse. That was Bess's idea, delivered without discussion or ceremony. She simply made up the back bedroom, showed me where the extra towels were, and told me she'd wake me at 7 because that was when coffee was ready. Roy had a dog, an old beagle named Porter, who had decided within the first day that I was his particular responsibility and spent most of his time lying across my feet, which was more comfort than I knew how to articulate. I learned during those weeks that Roy Calder was more than a man with a radio and a truck. He was part of an informal network. It didn't have a name, at least not one he used, of people in the Harlan Ridge area who had, over the years, become a resource for situations like mine. Retired professionals mostly, people with skills and connections and the time to use them. A former county prosecutor named Harold, who was 71 and had the energy of a man 20 years younger. A woman named Sylvia, who had worked in adult protective services for 3 decades and knew every legal mechanism available for exactly what had been done to me. A retired banker named Thomas, who understood financial instrument structures well enough to read Gerald's documentation and immediately identify 3 additional transactions Gerald had initially categorized as ambiguous. These were not perfect people. Roy had a temper he kept carefully managed, and it occasionally surfaced in the way he spoke about certain subjects. Bess was blunt to the point of discomfort sometimes, in the way of people who've decided that comfort is less important than truth. Harold told the same 2 stories repeatedly, without seeming to notice, and Patricia had to be reminded 3 times that I preferred to be copied on emails rather than just summarized after the fact. None of them had to be there. None of them owed me anything, and they were there anyway, every one of them, in the way that people are there when they've decided that something matters and they intend to see it through. I thought about that a lot during those weeks, about the difference between obligation and choice, about how Ethan, who was bound to me by blood and decades and every resource I'd ever given him, had chosen to leave me to die. And these strangers, bound to me by nothing but an old bridge project and a radio signal in a snowstorm, had chosen to stay. But meanwhile, Ethan was spending money. Gerald's documentation caught this in real time as he pulled records. In the 2 weeks following my disappearance, Ethan had liquidated 2 more accounts, transferred a significant sum through the LLC to an entity in another state, and made a down payment on a property in coastal North Carolina. A beach house, Gerald told me, showing me the record with the flat expression of a man who'd stopped being surprised by human behavior but hadn't stopped documenting it. A beach house, I said. 3 bedrooms, waterfront. Gerald flipped the page. He also paid off his outstanding divorce settlement to Diane in full, which is interesting. Why interesting? Because it suggests he was cleaning up loose ends, eliminating people who had leverage over him. He looked at me over his notebook. He thought this was over. He thought he'd won, and he was reorganizing his life accordingly. He had given a 3rd interview by then, this one to a regional paper rather than television. In it, he described his father as a man who had, in his later years, become increasingly reclusive and resistant to help. He used the word deteriorating twice. He said the family home would need to be sold eventually to settle affairs, which told me he was already moving toward having me declared legally dead or incompetent, the 2 mechanisms that would give him clean access to whatever remained. He also, in that interview, said something that I read and had to put down for a few minutes before I could continue. He said, "My father was a good man once. I think the losses he suffered changed him. I just hope that wherever he is, he found some peace." Was. Past tense. My father was a good man. He'd buried me in print before my body was even cold, which, as far as he knew, it was. I sat with that sentence for a long time. I let myself feel what it did to me. The specific, particular violence of being mourned by someone who killed you. And then I did what I'd been doing since the night in that cabin. I put it somewhere useful. I turned it into something that would matter in a courtroom. Patricia filed the initial legal action on a Thursday morning, 5 weeks after Roy pulled me out of the mountains. It was a civil matter. Financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, breach of fiduciary duty under the power of attorney, fraudulent transfer of real property. The criminal referral to the state police had already been made. That process moved on its own timeline, slower and more complicated, but moving. The civil filing required Ethan to be served. His attorney, someone who was not Marcus Fowler, who had by then been contacted by a state bar investigator regarding 3 other similar complaints, filed an immediate response challenging my competency. His argument was that I was not capable of bringing legal action on my own behalf because my mental state was compromised. He attached the television interviews as supporting evidence. He attached a letter from a physician I had never met, which was a detail that would later become significant. He's going to try to have you declared incompetent before you can testify against him, Patricia told me. It's the only play he has left. Can he do that? He can try. It requires a formal evaluation by a court-appointed examiner, which you'll undergo, which you'll pass. Because you are clearly competent, and any qualified examiner will see that within 5 minutes. She paused. But it buys him time, and it's designed to make you look unstable in the public record. The physician's letter is the concerning part. We need to know how that letter was obtained. Gerald found out within a week. The physician was a general practitioner in Roanoke who had seen me twice. Once for a routine visit in 2019, once for a follow-up in 2020. He had not examined me recently. He had not examined me at all since my cardiac episodes. He had written a letter describing progressive cognitive decline based on information provided to him by Ethan, and he had signed it without, apparently, considering carefully enough what signing it meant. When Patricia's office contacted him with the specifics of what he'd signed and the circumstances in which it would be used, there was a long silence on the phone, and then the physician said he would need to speak with his own attorney. He withdrew the letter 4 days later. His withdrawal statement, which became part of the record, described being given incomplete and misleading information by Ethan Grayson regarding his father's condition. That was the moment Ethan's constructed reality began to visibly crack. Not collapse, not yet, but crack, in the way of structures that have been stressed beyond their tolerance and are beginning to show it at the joints. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday in late January, 11 weeks after the night on the mountain. It was a preliminary civil proceeding, not a trial, but a hearing on the motion to have me declared incompetent, which had to be resolved before the financial exploitation case could proceed. Patricia had explained this clearly. If Ethan won this motion, everything else became exponentially harder. If we won it, his legal strategy collapsed at its foundation. I had not seen my son since he drove away from that cabin. I had thought about that moment many times, tried to decide how I would feel, what I would do, how I would manage being in the same room with him again. I'd expected something large, rage maybe, or grief, or both. What I felt walking into that courtroom was something I can only describe as clarity, the cold, structural kind, the kind that comes when you've done the calculations and you know exactly what the numbers say. The room was not large. A circuit court hearing room in a county courthouse. Wood paneling, fluorescent lights. The particular smell of old paper and floor wax. Patricia walked in ahead of me with Gerald and Harold. Roy and Bess were in the gallery, along with Sylvia and Thomas, and 2 investigators from the state police who were there in an observational capacity. Ethan was already seated at the opposing table with his attorney when we came in. He heard the door. He turned. I watched his face in that moment with the attention I would have given to a critical structural point, looking for the failure, watching for the exact instant the load exceeded the tolerance. It took perhaps 3 seconds for him to process what he was seeing. His face went through a sequence of expressions that his attorney, sitting beside him, apparently noticed. Because the attorney put a hand briefly on Ethan's arm in the way of someone communicating. Hold it together. Ethan held it together. He straightened. He looked away from me. He picked up the pen in front of him and held it and put it down. But I had seen his face in those 3 seconds. I had seen the thing underneath the composure. The thing he'd kept successfully hidden through 3 television interviews and a newspaper article and weeks of performing the role of grieving, devoted son. It was fear, pure and unmanaged and absolute. He had built everything on a dead man, and the dead man had walked into the room. Patricia leaned close to me as we took our seats. "You all right?" "Yes," I said, and I meant it in a way I hadn't meant anything in months. The judge entered. The proceedings began. Ethan's attorney presented the competency challenge with polished, careful language. The cardiac history, the grief following my wife's death, the alleged cognitive decline, the physician's letter that was no longer part of the record, a fact his attorney had to acknowledge when Patricia raised it. Then Patricia presented her response. She called me to give a brief account of my professional background and current cognitive functioning. She called Gerald, who outlined the financial documentation with the calm precision of a man reciting mathematics. She called Harold, who had reviewed the legal record and identified 4 specific instances in which Ethan had exceeded the authority granted by the power of attorney in ways that were unambiguous and documented. And then she introduced the emergency radio transmission record. Roy's radio equipment had a logging function he hadn't mentioned to me until the second day at the farmhouse, an automatic timestamp and recording feature that documented every transmission on the frequencies he monitored. My voice, the time, the date, the specific location I'd given, followed by Roy's response. The recording, played in that courtroom, lasted less than 4 minutes, but it placed me, alive and coherent and in distress, at that cabin on the night Ethan had reported me missing as a wandering, confused, elderly man. It placed me there at the exact time Ethan had told the sheriff's department he'd been unable to locate me, the time during which, the evidence showed, he had already driven back to Clover Falls and begun making financial transfers. The courtroom was not silent in the dramatic way of movies. People shifted. Papers moved. Someone in the gallery coughed. But there was a quality to the air in that room after the recording ended that I recognized from engineering work, the particular stillness that precedes a structural event, the moment before the load redistributes. The judge looked at Ethan's attorney over her glasses. "Counsel," she said, "I'm going to need you to help me understand how your client's account of events is consistent with what I've just heard." Ethan's attorney said something careful and measured about the evidence being subject to interpretation. The judge looked at him for a moment. Then she turned to her notes. She denied the competency motion in its entirety. She found, on the record, that Walter Grayson was fully competent to participate in legal proceedings on his own behalf. She ordered a preservation hold on all financial assets associated with the Grayson estate pending further proceedings. And she referred the matter of the physician's withdrawn letter to the state medical board for review. It took 11 minutes. I had spent 11 weeks surviving what Ethan had planned, and it took 11 minutes for the first wall of what he'd built to come down. I looked at my son across that room. He was staring at the table in front of him, his jaw set, his hands flat on the surface. His attorney was writing something quickly on a legal pad. Whatever Ethan was feeling, he had it managed now. The fear I'd seen in those first 3 seconds was locked away again behind the familiar architecture of his composure. But I knew what was under it. I had seen it. And I knew, with the certainty of a man who has spent his life calculating the point at which structures fail, that it was only a matter of time. The competency ruling changed everything and nothing at the same time. It changed the legal landscape completely. The preservation hold on the estate assets meant Ethan couldn't move another dollar, couldn't transfer another piece of property, couldn't restructure another LLC without a court order he was never going to get. Gerald described it as freezing the battlefield, which was an apt way to put it. Whatever Ethan had already taken was still out there, still requiring the slower work of recovery, but the bleeding had stopped. The wound was contained. What it didn't change was the fact that Ethan was still free, still living in his house, still presenting himself to anyone who hadn't seen the inside of that courtroom, as a man wronged by circumstance rather than a man caught mid-crime. His attorney had released a statement that afternoon, carefully worded, designed for public consumption, describing the ruling as a procedural matter and expressing his client's continued concern for his father's well-being. The phrase "complicated family situation" appeared twice. The phrase "ongoing dialogue" appeared once, which made Patricia laugh in a short, humorless way when she read it to me over the phone that evening. "Ongoing dialogue," I said. "His attorney is good at language," she said. "I'll give him that. What happens next?" The civil case proceeds. Gerald's financial documentation goes in as evidence. The state police investigation runs parallel. That's the criminal track, and that moves slower, but it's moving. She paused. "There's also something else. Something Gerald found this afternoon that I want to walk you through in person. Can you come to the office tomorrow morning?" I said I could. I didn't sleep well that night, which was becoming less unusual than I wished it were. Porter the Beagle slept against my legs, and I lay in the dark at Roy's farmhouse and stared at the ceiling and tried to prepare myself for whatever came next. I had learned over the previous weeks that preparation is mostly an illusion. You can steel yourself all you want. The thing that arrives is always different from the thing you braced for. Gerald was already at Patricia's office when I got there the following morning, his notebook open, a stack of printed documents beside his coffee cup. He had the look of a man who had been working since early and had found something that demanded he keep going. Sit down, Walter, Patricia said. She didn't say good morning, which told me something. Gerald turned the top document toward me. It was a financial record, account transfers, dates, amounts. I found a second trust, he said. I looked at him. What? When I was pulling the complete record of what Ethan transferred out of your accounts, I found a reference, indirect, in the metadata of one of the LLC filings to a trust instrument that predated the power of attorney, something established in 2019. He tapped the document. I had Thomas look at it. It's structured as a domestic asset protection trust. Separate legal entity, independent trustee, assets that are insulated from both creditor claims and from POA authority. I was quiet for a moment. I didn't create a trust in 2019. We know, Patricia said. That's the problem. Gerald turned another page. The trust was filed under your name and social security number with a signature that appears to be yours. The independent trustee listed is an entity in Delaware, a professional trust company. The assets transferred into it were significant. He named a figure. I sat back in my chair. The number was large enough that it took me a moment to locate it in my understanding of what I'd had. Ethan created a trust in my name, I said slowly, and transferred assets into it before he ever got the power of attorney. That's what the evidence suggests. He would have needed access to your personal information, your social security number, and either a forged signature or a very good approximation of one. Gerald's voice was flat and professional, the way it always was when he was describing something that should have made a person furious. Marcus Fowler's name appears in the filing as the drafting attorney. Patricia leaned forward. Here's what this means practically. There are assets in that trust that Ethan never touched directly. He couldn't, because the trust structure insulates them from his POA authority too. He may not have fully understood what he'd created. He may have intended to dissolve it and access the assets later, once you were legally dead. She paused. But because the trust exists in your name with your social security number, and because you are alive and competent, you have a legal basis to challenge it, void the fraudulent instrument, and reclaim what's in it. I looked at the figure on Gerald's page again. What Ethan had been chasing, what he'd built an entire architecture of fraud and abandonment to get, was less than what he'd accidentally preserved in a trust he couldn't touch. The irony of that would have been funny in different circumstances. How long? I asked. To unwind it? Months, probably. Trust litigation is slow, but Thomas knows the Delaware Trust Company. He's going to make a call. Patricia took off her glasses and set them on the desk. Walter, I want to be honest with you. The financial recovery is going to be complex and it's going to take time. Some of what Ethan moved through the LLC structures is going to be difficult to fully recover. Not impossible, but difficult. What we're confident about is the primary accounts, the Dunmore land, and now this trust. She looked at me steadily. You're not going to end up where you started, but you're not going to end up where Ethan intended either. I nodded. It was enough. It was more than enough. What it was, in the language I understood best, the structure was damaged, but the foundation held. The state police investigation had been running quietly while the civil case generated its noise, and it was the state police who arrested Ethan on a Thursday morning in early March, 14 weeks after the night on the mountain. I wasn't there. I found out when Patricia called me at Roy's farmhouse at 8:15 in the morning while I was on my second cup of coffee, and Roy was in the back field doing something with a fence post, and Porter was asleep under the kitchen table. They picked him up at his house, Patricia said. Charges include felony elder financial exploitation, fraudulent transfer of property, criminal misuse of power of attorney, and one count of felony assault. That's the abandonment on the mountain, charged under the statute covering reckless endangerment of a vulnerable adult. She paused. There may be additional charges as the investigation develops. Fowler was picked up simultaneously. 2 different police departments, coordinated. I put my coffee cup down very carefully on Roy's kitchen table. Walter? I'm here. Are you all right? I thought about that question. I thought about what all right meant, and whether it applied to a man sitting in a borrowed kitchen while his son was being handcuffed in a house bought with stolen money 14 weeks after he left his father to die in a snowstorm. I don't know yet, I said honestly. Patricia was quiet for a moment, in the way of a person who understands that some answers deserve not to be rushed past. That's fair, she said. Take the morning. I'll call you this afternoon with more details. I sat at that table for a long time after I hung up. Porter crawled out from under the table and put his head on my knee, the way he did when he decided I needed something he could provide. I put my hand on his head and sat there while the morning moved through the farmhouse windows. I wasn't crying. I want to be clear about that. Not because there's anything wrong with it, but because what I was feeling wasn't grief exactly. It was something that didn't have a clean name, a settling. The sound a building makes when the last piece of scaffolding comes down and the structure is standing on its own. 44 years. I had known Ethan for 44 years, had been his father for every one of them, and whatever had happened inside him, whatever combination of character and circumstance had built the man who drove his father up a mountain in winter and left him there, I would never fully understand it. I had accepted that. Some questions don't resolve. Some structures fail in ways that can't be entirely explained by the available data. What I could explain was this. He had made choices. Every step of it, the power of attorney, the accounts, the LLC, the cabin, had been a choice. Not a spiral, not a breakdown, not a cry for help in the language of destruction. A plan. Methodical, patient, executed over months. The choices of a man who had decided that his father's life was worth less than his father's money. I didn't know how to be a father to that man. I didn't know if I still was one, in any sense that mattered. But I knew, sitting in that kitchen with an old beagle's head on my knee, that I was no longer going to spend what remained of my life trying to figure it out. Ethan's bail hearing was 2 days later. His attorney argued for release on bond, citing his client's ties to the community and the complex nature of the financial charges. The prosecutor, a woman named Vasquez who Patricia spoke well of, argued against it, citing the deliberate nature of the abandonment and the risk of further asset concealment. The judge set bail at a number Ethan couldn't meet without liquidating assets that were now frozen. He stayed in custody. His attorney released another statement, this one considerably less polished than the first. The controlled language was showing strain at its edges, the way it does when the facts are running in only one direction. It described the charges as prosecutorial overreach and a tragic mischaracterization of a son's efforts to help an ailing parent. It said Ethan looked forward to presenting his side of the events in court. The local paper ran it. They also ran, on the same page, a piece by a reporter who had apparently been making calls for several weeks, a piece that included Gerald's financial summary, a description of the cabin and the snowstorm, Roy's account of receiving my radio transmission, and a photograph of Marcus Fowler's law office, which was now closed, its door sealed with a notice I didn't need explained to me. The woman at the front desk of the real estate office next to Fowler's reportedly told the journalist that she'd seen several older clients coming in and out of Fowler's office over the past 3 years, and that she'd always thought there was something off about the dynamic. She said she'd never said anything because she hadn't known what to say. I read that detail and held it for a while. The number of people who see something wrong and don't know how to speak into it, who talk themselves out of what they're observing because the alternative, being right and saying so, and dealing with what that means, is costly in ways that silence isn't. I understood that impulse. I had lived inside it for most of the year before the mountain. I had looked at the evidence assembling itself around my son and chosen, repeatedly, to find other explanations. Because the true explanation was too large and too terrible to hold. But silence has its own costs. I knew that now in a way I hadn't before. My silence had almost killed me. And Fowler's other clients, however many there were, whatever had been taken from them, had paid for the silence of everyone who'd noticed something wrong and looked away. In the weeks that followed Ethan's arrest, the civil case accelerated in the way that civil cases do once the criminal record starts providing undisputed facts. Gerald's documentation, combined with the financial records the state police subpoenaed, built a picture that Ethan's civil attorney, a different one now, the first having withdrawn, struggled visibly to counter. The Dunmore County land was the first asset recovered. The fraudulent LLC transfer was voided by the court, the property returned to my name, and an appraisal ordered. The actual value came in at roughly 4 times what Ethan had listed in the transfer documents. My primary retirement accounts were next, partially depleted but not emptied, because Ethan had apparently been more cautious there, aware that certain withdrawals triggered automatic reporting. What remained was recovered and the freeze converted to a permanent protective order while the criminal case was pending. The beach house in North Carolina was seized. Ethan had put it in his own name directly, an unusual lack of caution that Gerald attributed to arrogance, to the confidence of a man who had believed he was operating on a closed case. The property was liquidated, and the proceeds held in trust pending the civil judgment. The settlement paid to Ethan's ex-wife Diane, the one he'd made to eliminate her leverage, was examined separately. Her original divorce settlement had included provisions that, it turned out, gave her certain rights to financial information in exactly this kind of situation. Her attorney filed a related claim. I had no objection. Whatever Ethan had done to her in their marriage was its own ledger, one I had no standing to balance, but I wasn't going to stand in the way of what was right. Roy drove me to the civil settlement conference on a gray April morning, 4 months after the mountain. He waited in the truck in the parking lot, drinking coffee from a thermos, reading a farming magazine that was 6 months old. He hadn't asked to come. He'd just shown up at 7:30 and said he was driving, and I hadn't argued because arguing with Roy about a decision he'd already made was like arguing with weather. The conference lasted 3 hours. Patricia negotiated from a position of extraordinary strength, because the evidence was comprehensive and Ethan's legal position had been deteriorating since January in an unbroken line. His attorney, to his credit, was realistic about it. There was no version of the facts that made Ethan look like anything other than what he was. The settlement terms were read into the record. I won't detail every number. That's between me and the attorneys and the court. But what I can say is this. When Patricia walked out of that conference room and sat down beside me in the hallway, she looked at me with the expression of someone who has done a difficult job thoroughly and is quietly satisfied with the result. "It's not everything," she said. "Some of what he moved through the secondary LLC is going to stay complicated. But the core of what you had, and the trust Gerald found, those are yours." "The foundation trust?" I asked, because that was what I'd started calling it in my head. Not the fraudulent protection trust Ethan had built, but what I intended to do with what came back. Patricia looked at me. "You've been thinking about that." "For a while," I said. She was quiet for a moment. "Tell me." I told her what I'd been thinking since the farmhouse, since the long nights with Porter's weight on my feet, and the wood stove ticking and Roy's house holding itself solid around me. About what it meant to be 72 and stripped of everything and survive it. About what it meant that there were people who had made that survival possible not because they were obligated to, but because they had decided it mattered. About the Fowler clients I'd never meet, who had lost things they would never get back because no one had been paying attention, or because the systems that were supposed to protect them had moved too slowly, or because they had no Roy Calder monitoring a radio frequency on a winter night. Patricia listened to all of it without interrupting. "That's going to take some structure," she said when I finished. "Legal, financial, it's going to take time to set up correctly." "I have time," I said. And then, because it was true, more than I expected to a few months ago. She almost smiled. For Patricia, almost smiling was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Roy was still in the parking lot when I came out. He'd finished the magazine and was watching two crows investigate something in the far corner of the lot with the patient attention of a man who's comfortable with silence. He looked up when I came to the truck. "Well," he said. "It's done," I said. "The civil piece." He nodded once, the way he did when a thing was settled. He started the truck. We drove back to Harlan Ridge in the particular quiet of people who don't need to fill space with words, and the mountains came up on either side of the road as we climbed. And I looked at them the way I always did now, not with the fear of the man who'd spent a night fighting for his life in them, but with the recognition of someone who knows what a place has cost him and has decided the cost was not the final word. Ethan's trial date was set for September. The criminal charges were serious enough that his attorney had already opened preliminary discussions about a plea. Whatever happened in that courtroom was going to happen without me needing to manage it, because the evidence would carry itself. What I had to do now was something harder than surviving and something better than revenge. I had to decide what came next. What comes next, I learned, is never as clean as you imagine it while you're still in the middle of surviving. I had pictured something like resolution, a moment where the last legal document was signed, the last account was restored, the last piece of what Ethan had taken was returned to its proper place, and I could stand up straight and say, "Done." Finished. The structure holds. But real life doesn't work the way engineering calculations do. There's no clean load transfer, no moment where the numbers balance perfectly and the stress disappears. What there is instead is a gradual shifting of weight, a slow redistribution, and the understanding, which arrives quietly and without ceremony, that the structure you're rebuilding is going to look different from the one that was damaged. Not worse, necessarily. Just different. Ethan's criminal trial was scheduled for the second week of September. By July, his attorney had been in serious plea discussions with the prosecutor's office for 6 weeks, and the conversations were going in only one direction. Patricia kept me informed without pushing me to have opinions I hadn't formed yet. She was good at that, at giving me information without telling me what to do with it, which is a rarer quality in attorneys than it should be. They're offering to plead to 3 of the 6 charges, she told me on a Tuesday afternoon in late July. We were in her office, the window unit running against the summer heat, a box fan in the corner doing supplemental work. Felony financial exploitation, fraudulent property transfer, and reckless endangerment. In exchange for the plea, the prosecution drops the conspiracy charge related to Fowler and the 2 secondary fraud counts. What does he get? Sentencing guidelines on the combined charges put him at 4 to 7 years. With good behavior, he could be out in 3. 3 years. I sat with that number and tried to find a feeling about it that was the right size. I couldn't. The number felt simultaneously too small and somehow beside the point, not because I wanted more years added to it, but because I had come to understand, slowly and with difficulty, that no amount of time served was going to be the thing that made this right. Nothing was going to make it right. Ethan had done what he'd done, and I had survived it. And the law was going to do what the law does, and none of it was going to give me back the 8 months I'd spent trusting the wrong person, or the night in the cabin, or the version of my son I'd believed in before I knew better. "Walter," Patricia said, "do you want to make a victim impact statement?" "Yes," I said. I'd known that for a while. "Do you want to be in the room when he's sentenced?" That one took longer. "Yes," I said finally. "I want him to see me." Masan. The plea was entered on a Wednesday morning in August. I was in the courtroom. Roy drove me, as he had driven me to most things over the preceding months, with the same unhurried practicality he brought to everything. Bess had packed sandwiches for the drive, which was the kind of thing Bess did. Practical gestures of care delivered without comment or expectation of acknowledgement. The courtroom was more crowded than I expected. The Fowler connection had expanded the case in the public consciousness. There were 3 other families, it had emerged, whose elderly relatives had been processed through Fowler's office in similar arrangements over a 4-year period. 2 of those cases were being prosecuted separately. The 3rd family's relative had died before the fraud was discovered, which was the outcome Ethan had planned for me, and which I thought about every time I saw that family's adult daughter sitting in the gallery. Her name was Rosalie. She was in her mid-40s, and she had her mother's estate documents in a folder she carried everywhere, which Patricia had told me about. We had spoken briefly once, in the hallway outside the courtroom during a recess. She had looked at me with an expression I recognized, the expression of someone who is holding a grief that has no clean category, because it's layered. The grief for the parent who died, and the grief for what was taken from that parent, and the fury that those 2 things are tangled together and can't be fully separated. "You got out," she said to me. Not accusatory, just factual. "I did," I said. "My mother didn't." "I know." There wasn't anything adequate to say to that, so I didn't try to say anything adequate. "I'm sorry." She nodded. She looked at her folder. "I'm going to use what your attorneys put together," she said. "Gerald's financial documentation. Patricia said it's admissible in the secondary cases." "I know. I told them to share everything." She looked up at me. "Why?" It was a fair question. The documentation had taken Gerald months to build, and Patricia's office significant resources. Sharing it cost me nothing financially, but it was still a choice, to extend what I had beyond my own case, to use what I'd survived to serve something larger than my own recovery. "Because your mother deserves someone paying attention," I said. "And nobody did, in time. The least I can do is make sure the attention I'm paying now reaches further than just my own situation." Rosalie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'll be at the sentencing." "So will I," said. Son. Ethan was sentenced on a Friday in late September at 10 o'clock in the morning. He stood before the judge in a gray suit that was slightly too large. He'd lost weight, I noticed, in the months since the arrest. He looked diminished in the way of people who have been sustained by a particular kind of energy. The energy of pursuit, of scheming, of performing, and have had that energy removed. What was left without it was something smaller than I remembered, something I couldn't entirely recognize as the child I'd raised. His attorney gave a statement about remorse and the complexities of family dynamics and the pressures his client had been under. It was professionally executed, and I didn't believe a word of it, and I suspected the judge didn't either, though she listened to it with the composed attention of someone who has heard every version of every story and has learned to wait for the facts before responding. Then Vasquez spoke for the prosecution. She was precise and unsparing. The financial documentation, the timeline, the cabin, the radio transmission, the television interviews Ethan had given while his father was still fighting to survive a snowstorm. She described what Gerald had found, in language clear enough for the room to follow. She described Rosalie's mother, briefly but specifically. She described the physician's letter. She described Marcus Fowler, who had been sentenced separately 3 weeks earlier to 5 years and the permanent revocation of his law license. Then it was my turn. I had written the statement out. I'd rewritten it 4 times, crossing out the parts that were too angry, and the parts that were too forgiving, and the parts that were trying to be something other than honest. What was left by the 4th draft was something I could actually say out loud without performing it. I stood at the podium. The courtroom was quiet in a way that had weight to it. I looked at Ethan. He was looking at this table in front of him. Then, slowly, as if he felt the direction of my attention, he looked up. We held each other's eyes across that room for a moment, my son and I, in a courthouse, at the end of something that had started on an ordinary Tuesday evening with Thai food and carefully worded concern. I looked away first, not because I couldn't hold his gaze, but because I hadn't come here for a confrontation. I'd come to say what was true. Your Honor, I said, I am 72 years old. I spent 31 years building structures meant to hold weight, bridges, overpasses, the kind of work that doesn't get noticed when it's done right and can't be ignored when it fails. I believed for a long time that I understood something about what makes things hold. My voice was steady. I was surprised by that, and then I wasn't. My son used my grief against me. He used the months after I lost my wife, the worst months of my life, to position himself, legally and financially, to take everything I had built. He did it carefully. He did it patiently. And when the taking was nearly complete, he drove me into the mountains in a snowstorm and left me in a cabin that wasn't safe, without heat that worked, without a way to call for help. He drove away and he went home, and he gave television interviews about his missing, confused, declining father, and he waited for me to die. I paused, not for effect, because the next part required me to mean it, and meaning it required a moment. I survived. Not because I did everything right. I didn't. I made choices over those months that I would unmake if I could. I signed documents I should have questioned. I trusted when I should have verified. I let grief make me smaller than I needed to be. Those are my failures, and I own them. I looked at the judge. But there is a distance between a father's failures and what my son did in those mountains. I want that distance to be on the record. Whatever I did wrong, whatever I should have done differently, none of it created what he chose. Every step of what he did was a choice. His choice. I thought about Carol. I thought about her hands and her stubbornness and the things she'd said about Ethan 4 years before she died. He loves what things give him. And how I'd told her she was being too hard on him. I won't tell you I understand him, I said. I spent 44 years being his father, and I don't understand how a person decides that another person's life is worth less than what they own. I don't understand it, and I've stopped trying to. I took a breath. What I do understand is that people like my son exist, and that they find people like me, people who are grieving, or ill, or simply trusting, and they use that vulnerability as a tool. And the systems that are supposed to prevent that don't always move fast enough, and the people around them don't always know what to say, and so it continues. I looked at Rosalie briefly, where she sat in the gallery. I ask for the sentence that the law provides, I said, not out of bitterness, out of the belief that accountability is the only honest response to what happened here. For me. For the others. I gathered my pages. That's all I have. I went back to my seat. Roy put his hand briefly on my arm. One touch. 1 second. The way men of his generation express things they don't have words for. And then he took his hand away and we both looked forward. The judge sentenced Ethan to 6 years, at the upper end of the guidelines. She cited the deliberate and premeditated nature of the abandonment, the extended duration of the financial exploitation, and what she called a pattern of calculated deception directed at a vulnerable family member. She noted the Fowler connection. She noted Rosalie's mother. Ethan received the sentence without visible reaction. His face was the face I'd seen in the courtroom in January. Locked down, managed, the fear behind it not gone, but contained. His attorney touched his arm. He nodded at something his attorney said, and then he was taken out of the room, and that was the last time I saw my son. The Grayson Foundation for Elder Independence was incorporated in November of that year, on a gray Tuesday morning that smelled like rain coming. Patricia handled the legal structure. Gerald worked with a financial advisor, not Dennis, who was happily retired in Scottsdale, but a younger woman named Camille, who had been recommended by 3 separate people and who asked exactly the right questions at our first meeting. Roy sat in on that meeting, uninvited, and contributed 2 observations that turned out to be correct, which surprised no one who knew him. The Foundation's purpose was specific, because I had learned the hard way that vague purposes drift and diffuse and lose their force. It would do 3 things: fund legal representation for elderly adults in cases of financial exploitation and elder abuse, support the informal networks, the Roy Calders of the world, the people with radios and trucks and decades of knowing who to call, that operated outside official systems and often got there first, and provide a small grant program for adult protective service workers to receive training in financial fraud identification, because the frontline people were often the first to notice something wrong and the least resourced to act on it. Bess had an opinion about the name. She told me at dinner one evening, about 3 weeks before the incorporation, that Foundation for Elder Independence sounded like something a government agency would name itself. "What would you call it?" I asked. She thought about it while she passed the bread. "Something that tells people what it actually does, which is catch people before they fall all the way." "The Grayson Catch Foundation," Roy said, without looking up from his plate. Bess looked at him. "That's terrible." "I know." We kept the original name, but I thought about what Bess said for a long time afterward. Catch people before they fall all the way. And I put it into the Foundation's mission statement, buried in the operational language where it would be read by people who read those documents carefully. That is what it does. What I wanted it to do. Not to reverse what had already happened. You can't reverse it. You can only document it and address the consequences. But to close the gap between when something starts going wrong and when someone finally says something. To be the radio signal on the right frequency. The grand opening of the Foundation's first physical office, a suite of rooms in a building in Clover Falls, 15 minutes from the house Carol and I had shared for 38 years, was held on a Saturday in April, a year and a half after Roy Calder drove his old Ford up a snow-covered mountain to find a stranger who'd been left there to die. It was not a grand event. I want to be clear about that because I have no patience, at 72, for grand events. It was a Saturday morning gathering in a well-lit office suite with folding chairs and decent coffee, and too many people crowded into a space not quite large enough for all of them, which is the sign of a successful gathering, in my experience. Roy and Bess were there. Harold was there, telling his 2 stories to anyone who'd stand still long enough. Gerald came with his wife. Patricia came alone and stood in the corner with a coffee cup and the expression of someone quietly checking a box on a list she'd kept for a long time. Sylvia brought 2 colleagues from her years in adult protective services. Thomas brought his wife and his adult son, who apparently had questions about the Foundation's investment structure that we spent 20 minutes discussing in the kitchen. Rosalie was there. She'd become involved in the Foundation's development over the preceding months, first as someone with a personal stake in its existence, then as someone with ideas about how it should operate, then as someone I'd asked to join the advisory board because her ideas were consistently better than mine, and she wasn't afraid to say so. She arrived with a folder, as she always did, and a coffee she'd brought from somewhere else, because she didn't like the coffee I'd ordered, a fact she had mentioned more than once. "It looks real," she said, standing beside me in the main room while people moved around us. "It is real," I said. I know, She looked around the room, at the framed mission statement on the wall, at the case intake forms stacked on the reception desk, at the two attorneys Patricia had helped me hire who were talking in the corner with Harold, who was explaining something to them with the particular energy of a man who doesn't recognize when his audience has reached capacity. It's different when it's a room and not just a plan. Everything is, I said. She nodded. She was quiet for a moment, holding her outside coffee with both hands. My mother would have found this very practical, she said finally. Is that a compliment? From her, it would have been the highest one, wasn't. After the gathering, after the folding chairs were stacked and the coffee was finished and the last person had shaken my hand and driven away, I sat alone in the office for a while. Roy and Bess had offered to wait, but I'd told them to go ahead, that I'd lock up, that I wanted a few minutes. The office was quiet, in the particular way of rooms that have just held a lot of people and are now empty. The afternoon light came through the windows at a long angle, the way April light does, landing on the desk and the mission statement on the wall and the stack of case intake forms and the framed photograph I'd put on the windowsill that morning. The photograph was of Carol, not a formal one, a snapshot from a camping trip we'd taken in our 40s somewhere in the Blue Ridge. She was laughing at something off camera, her hair messy from wind, wearing a flannel shirt that was mine and that she'd appropriated permanently within 2 days of the trip and never returned. She looked like herself, entirely. The way people only look in photographs taken when they didn't know they were being watched. I looked at that photograph for a long time. I thought about everything she had known about our son that I had refused to see. I thought about how she'd tried to tell me, in the careful way of a woman who loved her husband enough not to want to be right about something like this, and how I dismissed it because I needed to believe the version of Ethan I'd built in my head. My version. My failure. She had deserved a better husband in that particular way. Sharper. Less stubborn about the things that mattered. But she'd also known, when she married me, what she was getting. She'd said so explicitly on our third date, which I've always thought was the bravest thing anyone has ever said to me directly. You're difficult and you're certain about things you should be less certain about, and you're going to drive me absolutely crazy, and I'm going to marry you anyway. She was right on all counts. I wish she could see this room. Not because she would have been effusive about it, she wouldn't have been. She'd have walked around and checked the practical details and made 2 or 3 pointed observations about things that could be improved. And then she'd have sat down with her coffee and said something that cut directly to the thing that actually mattered, the way she always did. She'd have said, "You've finally figured out what the bridge is for, Walt." That was Carol, not the structure, the purpose. I thought about Ethan, which I still do and probably always will, in the way you think about wounds that have closed but left a mark. He would be in a correctional facility in Western Virginia for at least another 4.5 years. I had not attempted to contact him. He had not attempted to contact me. Whatever was left between us, whatever thread, thinner than anything I can measure, I didn't know yet what to do with it, and I had decided to stop forcing an answer. Some structures you rebuild. Some you assess, honestly, and determine that the damage is foundational, and you don't rebuild on a compromised foundation. You clear the site and you start elsewhere. I had started elsewhere. I stood up. I picked up my jacket from the back of the chair. I took one more look at the room, the mission statement, the intake forms, the photograph. And then I turned off the lights and locked the door and walked out into the April afternoon. Roy's truck was still in the parking lot. Of course it was. He was sitting in the driver's seat reading the same farming magazine, 3 months old now, that he'd had on the seat since March. "I told you to go," I said, getting in. "I know," he said. He started the truck. We drove. The mountains came up on the horizon as we headed toward the ridge, the way they always do, gradually, then all at once, which is the way most important things in life announce themselves. I looked at them. The Harlan Ridge Mountains, blue-gray in the afternoon light, still carrying snow on their upper faces even in April. The mountains where my son had left me. The mountains where Roy's radio had reached me. The mountains that had tried to kill me, and in doing so, had stripped everything down to what actually held. I had been afraid of them for a while. Not the physical fear of the night in the cabin, that had been acute and specific and had passed, but a deeper unease, the kind that settles into a place in your memory and stays there, making you flinch when you drive through certain elevations, or smell certain kinds of cold air. That unease had faded without my noticing it happening. The way healing works. Not a moment, but a process. And then one day you look up and the weight has redistributed and you can breathe in the places where you couldn't before. I looked at those mountains and I felt what I can only describe as recognition. Not warmth, not forgiveness of what had happened there. Just the acknowledgement of something that had tested the structure and revealed where it was weak, and in doing that, had shown me where it was strong. I was 72 years old. I had lost my wife and been robbed by my son and left to freeze in the mountains, and I had gotten up off that cabin floor and found a radio and called for help and survived the night. I had stood in a courtroom and said the true thing out loud. I had spent a year and a half building something that would outlast me, that would matter to people I would never meet, that would use what I had survived to close a gap that shouldn't exist but does. I was not a perfect man. I had never been. I was difficult and certain about things I should have been less certain about, and I had driven Carol crazy in the ways she'd predicted, and I had failed my son in ways I would carry regardless of what he'd done, because failure doesn't become not failure just because the other person's choices were worse. I had trusted wrong and looked away too long and signed my name on a document I should have questioned. But I was still here. That mattered. Not as a triumph. Survival is not a triumph, it's a foundation, but as a fact. A load-bearing fact. The kind you build from. Roy pulled into the driveway of his farmhouse. Porter erupted from the porch at the sound of the truck, doing the arthritic version of his younger run, all enthusiasm and reduced coordination. Bess's light was on in the kitchen. The farmhouse held itself solid against the evening sky the way it always did, added onto and impractical-looking and absolutely sound. "You all right?" Roy asked. Same question Patricia had asked him in that courthouse hallway in January. The question I'd answered honestly then, and answer honestly now. "Yeah," I said. "I think I actually am." He nodded once. He got out of the truck. Porter transferred his attention immediately to Roy's boots, which was the correct priority given the length of time Roy had been gone. I sat in the truck for another moment, looking at the mountains in the last of the light. I thought of one thing Carol used to say. Not a piece of wisdom, just something she'd say on the good evenings, the ordinary ones, when we'd had dinner and the dishes were done and the house was quiet. "Still standing, Walt?" Still standing. I got out of the truck. I went inside where the wood stove was going and the coffee was on, and the people who had chosen to be there were there, not because they had to be, but because that is what people who actually love you do. They stay.